2NURFM.com, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
Being a Tuesday means we take a little look at politics and what's been happening on the state and federal front. We're joined from the University of Newcastle by Associate Professor in Politics, Dr. Jim Joes. What a big week it's been. There's been a little bit of movement, not necessarily here, but around the country. In Victoria, we've got Ted Baillieu, who was the Premier. He stepped down. Now Denis Napthine in there. And they went to the polls in Western Australia, and a defeat for the ALP with Liberal Premier Colin Barnett now assuming government, and ALP's Mark McGowan gone, Jim.
Yes, Dave. Good morning. We need to sort of put that in a bit of perspective. Yes, it was a defeat for the Labor Party in the sense that they didn't win the election, but they weren't in government to start with. They were the Libs were a minority government, and Colin Barnett's turned that minority status into being able to govern in his own right, which for him and for the Liberal Party in Western Australia is very pleasing, because they've moved out of that minority status and into a more, shall we say, a more stable space, although it wasn't that unstable either. I mean, I think if we look at WA, we've got an example of a different party and minority government, but not affecting government as such. We're seeing that the governing still takes place without any real problems being generated. So as far as the WA voters are concerned, they've made it quite clear they've now got a Liberal Party that is governing in its own right, or at least in a coalition arrangement with the Nationals and so forth. So, yeah.
It leads me to the question that I wanted to ask you this morning is it more beneficial for those living there and constituents in the state if the state that you've got being governed is the same as the one that's the federal governing the country? So if you've got Labor in state and Labor as federal, or Liberal or coalition in state and Liberal, does it work better for you with funding and everything you need to get, or is it a little more difficult when they're separated?
Well, the answer to that question is the contradiction, yes and no. It is beneficial in some ways, because you would expect that the ideological alignment between the two parties, if they're the same, is like if they're both Labor parties or they're both Liberal parties, you're going to get a degree of understanding and commitment and an expectation from the federal sphere that the state sphere won't do stuff that will, shall we say, destabilise the federal government. On the other hand, each of the state and territories, the leaders, the premiers and chief ministers, are about maximising the gains for their particular state or territory. So they're not going to be necessarily towing any fixed line, especially where they can see their own state's interests needing to come first. And all premiers and all chief ministers, and to some extent prime ministers, each play the others off against each other, and the federal government will try and play the states off and blame the states, or at least say that this is not our problem, it's a state problem, and the states will say, well, we'd love to do something about this, but the federal government won't come to the party. Now this, regardless of party politics, regardless of the particular nature of the government of the day, this is the game that's often played. And so even when you had all state Labor governments and a federal Labor government, it didn't necessarily come out smooth sailing. You had a lot of other factors coming into play. Most prominently would be that each premier wanting to make sure that they didn't get the blame for things that weren't delivered in their state. That's often passed off as a federal problem with the federal government, not giving them enough money to do what needs to be done. So party politics doesn't necessarily come into play there. It does, however, come into play when the federal government perhaps is trying to gain some leverage or some cooperation so that they can appear to be solving a problem even if nothing is really moving forward. So you get a sort of...
Can you see a leaning or a favouritism? So if it is in a situation where it's coalition for state and federal, can they lean towards there, or does it look to be showing some favouritism with the financial pie money-wise to other states?
Sometimes. Yeah. Sometimes you can see that happening, and particularly when you have mixed... at the state level, you have a Labor Party in South Australia, and you have a Liberal Party in WA, now in Queensland, and Victoria. So some of the states, particularly South Australia and Tasmania, have tried to sort of maximise their gains because we're the only Labor states left, so you've got to look after us. I'm not sure that they get that much mileage, but they do try it on and try to make sure that they can maximise their state's benefits. It's a bit more difficult in relationship to coalition states, and the federal Labor government's probably had more problems in that regard, trying to get them on side for major reforms. But if we take a step back, and the sort of understated achievement of the Gillard government has been, as a minority government, getting agreement from governments with a different ideological persuasion and getting them to come along with a federal government initiative, like the National Disability Insurance Scheme and so on. So we have seen a bit of negotiation. It was pretty hard negotiation because the states, particularly WA and now New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria, could play a bit of hardball with the federal government. But even given the different political stripes, they managed to sort of get some degree of agreement on where they were needing to go over particular major reform issues at the sort of national level.
If we bring that back to our local level, just to concentrate on our area here, how difficult is it for somebody who's in the opposition to our state government at the moment, like a Sonia Hornery, member of Walsingham, or a Clayton Barr, member for Cessnock, who are the opposition to who is in state at the moment? Is that difficult for them? Are they sort of spinning wheels, trying to get funding, trying to get things, or in the hope that in the next election their party will get in?
At the state level, it's difficult, of course, because their counterparts who are actually in power are going to want to take credit for whatever happens. And they're also going to not want to see, shall we say, resources going to electorates that are in the opposition camp. So there will be a degree of, shall we say, a little bit of argy-bargy about how this should be sorted out. On the other hand, the Labor members at the state level, depending on their status within the Labor Party, may be able to get some leverage at the federal level by getting the federal government to consider particular ways of supporting initiatives in their area.
Doing what they can for them, I imagine.
Yeah, but this is sort of, at one level we expect this to happen, but at another level it's a lot harder for it to happen. And it's a lot harder in the sense that, yes, governments pork barrel, and what that expression means is that governments sort of hand out resources and favours in the hope of getting extra votes around election time. We understand that's the norm, but at election time at least. But generally speaking, through the non-election period of governments, federal governments are a bit loath to bypass the state governments directly. They are much more circumspect about that, and regardless of the political stripes of the governments involved, generally speaking, if we look at it structurally in terms of Australian politics, federal governments bypass state governments at their peril, because it's even when they deliver money to the state governments can then find ways and means of not actually delivering it to where the federal government expects it to go. So when federal governments do not take due heed of state governments, they can come unstuck anyway. So it's a in a sense that the federal structure, Dave, is really quite complicated in many ways, and federal governments, regardless of their political persuasion, have to deal with each of the states as entities that are trying to maximise their own benefits for their own citizens, and therefore it doesn't really matter what the political stripe is, they're going to be looking to play the politics to their advantage. So it's really quite a tricky situation, and even if you try to read off from the party politics that this is a particular stripe, this is a particular party brand, or whatever one likes to call it, it doesn't necessarily follow that the actual policy outcome will follow the political ideologies. It's really a matter of negotiation and accommodation, and for the most part, it seems to sort of deliver most of the time. And every now and again, of course, we get a glitch and things don't happen the way they want. But John Howard faced, shall we say, Labor governments that were not necessarily supportive, and now Julia Gillard's facing a number of states who aren't going to be necessarily supportive. But both Prime Ministers were quite adept at managing and negotiating with state premiers, even if they were on different sides of the fence. And both of them, I think, were quite successful at it, much more so than some previous prime ministers.
As we cast an eye over politics this morning, we do it every Tuesday with Associate Professor in Politics from the University of Newcastle, Dr. Jim Joes, back again next Tuesday morning at 2 NURFM.